Thank you for being here this morning. Welcome to week 6 of Exploring LDS History, where we are doing our best to give an honest, factual account of the founding of the LDS Church. And I realize if you are here this morning and you are LDS or you're watching this online, that you'd prefer to, they've kind of shifted to going, they would prefer to go by the Church of Jesus Christ, and they've kind of changed in that regard. I am using LDS in this class just for the sake of clarity and who it is that we are talking about, since that's historically what they have been known as. But what we're trying to do in this class is look at the founding of the church and stick to just the historical facts and what we can discern and what we can glean. But at the same time, to do that in a loving manner, to be loving, but at the same time be honest. And these things we're talking about in this class, it's hard because we're talking about worldview issues and we're talking about weighty issues. And every human being on the face of planet Earth has a worldview. They have a lens through which they view the world that helps them explain reality in terms of the big questions of life that we all ask. Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Is there a God? If there is a God, how do we know Him? All human beings are wrestling with these questions, and they're heavy questions and they're important questions, but we don't all answer those questions the same way. So, if I'm having a conversation with a Muslim or a Hindu, I'm not going to answer those questions the same way that they would, and so we're going to disagree. And coming from an evangelical Christian perspective, when we discuss these issues, those worldview issues with people from an LDS background, we are not going to have the same answer to a lot of those questions. And so what we're trying to do in this class is answer and deal with those big questions of life, but do so in a way that's honest, but also caring. And so I'm doing my best to follow the encouragement of Scripture that tells us that our speech should always be gracious and seasoned with salt, so that we can have an answer for how every person, for the hope that we have in Jesus Christ and the truth of the gospel. And so we will do our best to be gracious and at the same time honest. So in recent weeks, we've gone back and forth through this time period from 1820 to 1827, where 1820, Joseph Smith had his first vision of God the Father and Jesus Christ. In 1823, the second vision when he was first visited by Moroni. And then 1827, when Moroni allows him to finally recover the golden plates, and he begins the translation of the Book of Mormon. And so we've looked at Joseph Smith's life in that time span in great detail in recent weeks, so we can kind of get a feel for his life and what was going on in his worldview. And we've seen that his worldview was very shaped by the occult and cultic practices, and he grew up in a family and in a culture that very much believed in ghosts and witches and buried treasure and those sorts of things. And we've seen how that influenced his position or his thinking in this time period. And we looked last week at how this massive anti-Masonic movement that was going on in his neck of the woods in that day and age, how that influenced his thinking even in the Book of Mormon text and later in Mormon temple endowment ceremonies. And so hopefully we've been able to get inside his head a little bit and see some of the things that will come into play when we finally get today to the arrival of the Book of Mormon, where in 1827, according to the official account by the church and Joseph Smith's account, that's when Moroni finally allows him to go and recover the plates that he first found, you might remember, in 1823. But Moroni wouldn't let him take them then, and he said, I had to go back every year until 1827. 1827, Moroni finally allows him to retrieve those plates. And you might remember from the lesson a couple weeks ago, 1827, this is right after his trial for money digging up in Pennsylvania, and where he kind of got leg bail and left, and he took his brand new bride, Emma, and they returned to New York, where they were both living with his parents at the time. And that's where we will kind of resume things today. So just to kind of give you a brief overview, And we're going to go in this great detail. I mean, probably we're going to be on how the Book of Mormon came about the next 2 or 3 weeks to get through this story. But just be a brief timeline of how the Book of Mormon came about. So in 1827, Moroni finally delivers the plates to Smith. Nobody is allowed to see the plates. Nobody's ever allowed to see the plates. We will get to that in the weeks ahead. But people hear about the plates, and everybody wants to see the plates. And so various townspeople were trying to steal them. They were living in poverty with Smith's parents, and Emma wasn't happy. And so they eventually moved to, according to Joseph Smith, because of this great persecution, trying to get the plates, they moved back to Harmony, Pennsylvania, where they move into a house on Emma's parents' property, and that they're going to stay there through the remainder of this process while he translates the golden plates. So in January of 1828, he begins translating the first characters from the plates, and then April to June of 1828, he translates 119 pages of the plates of Lehi, or the books of Lehi. And Emma serves as his primary scribe in that period while he's translating. She was the one copying it. Martin Harris serves as his scribe in that time period. You might remember Harris. Harris was his benefactor. Harris is the one, if anybody ever believed in Joseph Smith, Harris did, and he went to his grave believing in Joseph Smith. And he was also a man of some means, so he financed Joseph Smith during this period of time. He paid for the move to Pennsylvania, paid so that he could, they would have a living while Smith translated the plates. So Harris translated that first 119 pages. The problem was Harris was a believer. Man, he was a believer. But his wife was not. And his wife was convinced Joseph Smith was a fraud, and he was taking advantage of her husband, and that, Smith was milking him for all of their money. And so she didn't think highly of Smith at all, and she didn't buy into any of it. So after they translated 119 pages from these plates of Lehi, Harris convinces Joseph Smith to let him take these 119 pages to his wife so that he can prove to her this is legit. Right? If she just reads these, then she will believe. And so he does so, and Harris's wife promptly takes those pages and hides them and refuses to give them back. She steals them, and she says, essentially, if he's really a prophet, then it shouldn't be a big deal for him to translate them again. And he can translate them again, and then we can compare the two, and if they match, then you might be onto something. And I kind of go, I see where she's going, right? That kind of makes sense. And so this led to quite a conundrum, and there's a lot of things that go down all at once here. Harris is absolutely distraught, Martin Harris, that he's lost the manuscript. Joseph Smith's distraught that the manuscripts have been lost, but at the same time all of this is going down, Joseph and Emma's first child is born, and that child dies shortly after birth. And Emma herself was very sick for a long time, and they thought they might lose her from complications from the childbirth. So they had other things going on, right? And they're dealing with all of that, and he had bigger fish to fry than translation at the moment. And so there's kind of a period here where their lives are in disarray. Smith also said that because he had lost that manuscript, Moroni came and took the plates away from him during this time period, so he didn't have them anymore to translate from in the first place. And it wasn't until September of that year that Moroni came and said, all right, I'll give them back to you. I'll give you another chance, but you're not going to translate the plates from Lehi. So we'll get into all this in more in detail. God told him, nope, you lost those and you don't get to translate them again. They're just gone. And so he begins translating the next section of the plates of Nephi. And the plates of Lehi were just gone, and we'll come back to that. So February, March then of 1829, Smith begins to translate again with Emma as his scribe. Martin Harris had lost his rights to be the scribe after losing the manuscript, so Emma steps in. She serves as his scribe until April, when Oliver Cowdery shows up in Harmony to meet Smith, and he buys in, and he becomes his scribe. And really, the bulk of all of the Book of Mormon was translated in this 4-year window from 4-month window from April to July of 1829. So once Smith and Cowdery got together, they really were able to crank it out. And it's amazing when you look at it that they were able to do so in just 4 months. So the bulk of the translation takes place between then. Then they had to secure financing and how are we going to get it published. And Martin Harris actually mortgages his farm to pay for the translation of the Book of Mormon. And in March of 1830, the first copies of the Book of Mormon go on sale. And then just a month later, the church is officially organized. So that's kind of the window we're going to be looking at, how all of this, what was going on in this time period over the next few weeks. So, for those who may not be aware, I want to take just a minute. So they crank out, he translates from these golden plates, this ancient record. And this is the storyline of the Book of Mormon. And I realize a lot in here, you've probably never read the Book of Mormon. You may not be familiar. And just so it'll make a little bit more sense, the things we're going to talk about over the next couple weeks, I thought I'd just give you the basic plot of the Book of Mormon in just a nutshell. The Book of Mormon actually covers 2 distinct people groups over a period of about 2,500 years of history or so. And the first of those people groups dates all the way back to 2000 BC or 2200 BC, depending on who you read, when you date the Tower of Babel. Because the Book of Mormon starts with the Tower of Babel, which you might be familiar with if you've read the book of Genesis, when God confounded the languages. According to the Book of Mormon, there was a tribe there, the Jaredites, whose language wasn't confused because they were very righteous. And so their language is not confused. And the Holy Spirit reveals to one of those Jaredites how they could build ships. And they used those ships in 2200 BC, 2000 BC. Using those ships, they sail across the Atlantic on an epic 344-day journey to the Americas. And just an interesting thing, and I don't want to read too much into this, but we've seen, seer stones had a very big influence in Joseph Smith's life and would continue to have an influence in his life for years to come. It's interesting that these Jaredites, they built these ships, and they get in the ships, and they're dark. There's no windows. And so they can't see anything inside these ships. And so God provides them with these special stones that he illuminates from within. And those stones stay lit by the hand of God to light their ships while they're on this year-long journey across the Atlantic. I don't want to read too much into that, but it's just an interesting thing that works its way into the story there that may have some correlation to Joseph Smith's life in 1830. So the Jaredites eventually, they make their way to America where they found a massive civilization, a huge civilization, that lasts until about 400 BC, or 600 BC, I apologize. From about 2000 BC to 600 BC, there's this Jaredite civilization in the Americas that is massive. They built a paved 2,700-mile highway across the Americas. All kinds of other building projects and things that they do. So it's this huge civilization. And like a lot of times we read in the Bible, they eventually forget their faith. They eventually walk away from God. And I do see some parallels in the Book of Mormon story and biblical history. Some of it, you could just go, it's not just biblical history, it's human history. We tend to forget God. But just like the Israelites, went through ups and downs in their walk with God in the Old Testament, the Jaredites are kind of the same. They eventually fall away from God completely. They become very wicked, and wars break out among the Jaredites. And again, this is a civilization of at least hundreds of thousands of people in the Americas. And then about 600 BC, their record ends in total tragedy. They go to war with one another. And in a series of battles, the entire Jaredite race is wiped out. Every single one of them. Every Jaredite dies. And again, it's a massive civilization, but they totally wipe each other out except for one last Jaredite, a man by the name of Corian Tumor, is the only Jaredite who survives. So the entire race is wiped out. And that happens at about 600 BC. At the same time, in 600 BC, all the way across the ocean in Jerusalem, there was a prophet by the name of Lehi. And so he would have been a contemporary. He's not mentioned in Scripture, but he would have been a contemporary of like Isaiah and Jeremiah and other prophets who were preaching in this time period. Lehi was preaching to the people in Jerusalem to repent of their sins and turn back to God. And just like they did not listen to Isaiah and Jeremiah, they didn't listen to Lehi either. Lehi had a son named Nephi, who was also shown in this time period a vision. And again, this is 600 years before Jesus was born. He received this prophecy from God. God told Nephi, "I looked and beheld the Lamb of God, that he was taken by the people. Yea, the Son of the everlasting God was judged of the world, and I saw and bear record. And I, Nephi, saw that he was lifted up on a cross and slain for the sins of the world." So Nephi supposedly has this prophecy from God 600 years before Jesus was ever born. Of course, Lehi and his family, they get out of Jerusalem before the Babylonians come and before Jerusalem is destroyed. They get out of Dodge and they live in the wilderness for a while where they build ships. And then Lehi and his family, his sons, they sail on these ships to America. And Lehi had 6 sons: Laman, Lemuel, Sam, not Samuel, just Sam. Laman, Lemuel, Sam, Nephi, Jacob, and Joseph. They get on these ships, they sail to the Americas, where they found a civilization in the Americas. At about the same time, the Jaredite civilization was dying out. So after arriving in America, they formed 2 distinct people groups: the Lamanites, who were generally more wicked, and the Nephites, who generally speaking are more righteous. And these both grow into the massive civilizations on their own. And it's interesting again how this there's very real similarities to Old Testament biblical history where, in the nation of Israel, they divided into 2 distinct kingdoms. And you had the northern kingdom that generally speaking was more evil, and the southern kingdom that generally speaking was more righteous. And the same thing kind of happened with the Lamanites and the Nephites. And so the bulk of the story of the Book of Mormon is just the story of these 2 people groups from 600 BC till about 400 AD. And rulers rise and rulers fall. They follow God, they fall away. Prophets rise up. And so it just follows their storyline for this 1,000-year period. I should mention, too, that the Lamanites, because of their wickedness, they are cursed by God with dark skin. And LDS leaders for decades and decades and decades have taught that the Lamanites are the principal ancestors of Native Americans. And the reason that they have dark skin is that they were cursed by God. And so you will often see, and I've taken all of these images from LDS works of art. You'll often see they try to tie these people in with Mayans and Aztecs and a culture that's very similar. And so here we have a depiction of Samuel the Lamanite, who looks very Native American in this picture. So for generations, they have prophets in the Book of Mormon who try to call the people back to God, and just like in Old Testament history, the people don't tend to not listen. One of those was this guy in 5 BC named Samuel, who preached to the people from the city walls that Jesus is getting ready to be born. The Messiah is going to be born soon, and you should repent and you should get ready, but the people largely don't listen. And then the main thing that happens in the Book of Mormon, probably the most important event that happens in the Book of Mormon, is after Jesus' resurrection in Jerusalem and after he appeared to his disciples there, and he founded the church and was ascended back to heaven. After he appeared to people in Jerusalem, he also appeared to these Jews. And remember, these are Jews, this massive Jewish civilization in America at the time of Jesus. He appeared to them, and he appointed 12 apostles among the Nephites, and he established a Christian church in America in 33 AD. A church that did very well for about 300 years after he started the church in America and ascended to heaven. They follow Jesus. They are very faithful till about 300 AD or so. And then things start to fall apart, and ultimately the Book of Mormon ends in tragedy as well, that the Nephites eventually become even more wicked than the Lamanites, and we saw a bit of that last week. It was through the influence of these Gadianton robbers and all of their secret oaths and combinations. They lead all of the Nephites away. They all become very wicked. They all forsake God. They forsake Jesus. And then the two groups begin to fight and battle amongst each other. And there's a series of wars that culminates in one final battle. And I just want you to think about this logistically for a minute. I've never been able to quite wrap my head around how this would work, because this is a massive civilization spread out over continents, not just America, but South America. All of the Nephites and all of the Lamanites gather for battle at the hill Cumorah in New York. And apparently, including the men, women, and children, everybody's there. Because in this battle, the Lamanites completely wipe out the Nephites. There are only, if I remember right, it's 20 or 24 Nephites remaining at the end of the battle, and the Lamanites eventually hunt them down. And the Lamanites, their civilization's decimated as well. And so these two civilizations wipe each other out, and the few Lamanites that survive, they go on to become the principal ancestors eventually of the Native Americans, who, because they didn't have these records and they lost the ability to read, they forgot their history. All of this thousands of years history that by the time Europeans showed up in, 1500 AD, when Europeans started showing up in the Americans, they had completely lost all of this history, and it wasn't known to them anymore. And so these two great civilizations wipe each other out, and the few who go on to survive become the principal ancestors of the American Indian. It's part of the reason why in early LDS church history, they believed part of their principal calling was to win the Native Americans and to convert them, because they were the lost tribes of Israel. And so their responsibility was to, convert them. The Native Americans were going to come to Jesus in large number, and then Jesus was going to come back. And that was a very prominent part of early Mormon theology. All right, so Moroni, who is the son of Mormon, he's the last surviving prophet and the last surviving Nephite in the Book of Mormon. He's the only Nephite of the entire civilization who survives. He abridges the Book of Mormon with some plates some letters his father had written that he writes out that are correcting doctrines that were being perverted in his day. And remember, this is about 400 AD. And this is also another place where you see common issues in Joseph Smith's day finding their way into the Book of Mormon. You might remember, for instance, in Joseph Smith, there's great revival going on in Palmyra, and all the denominations are fighting, and he's going, which church should I join? Because they're all arguing, and the Presbyterians are saying we're right, and the Baptists are saying we're right, and which church do I join? And so some of those kind of issues that the denominations were debating pop up in the Book of Mormon. And for instance, one that comes up in these letters that are included from Moroni, he said Mormon was including the teaching that he was very much against infant baptism. And so those letters condemn infant baptism very strongly. which was a big issue in Joseph Smith's day in 1830 that they were debating. But according to the Book of Mormon, it was also a big issue in 400 AD among the Christian churches in America in that day, and it condemns infant baptism. So you see some kind of interesting intersection there. All right, at any rate, Moroni is the last surviving Nephite. He takes the golden plates before he dies, and he buries them in the hill Cumorah, where they would rest until 1827, when Joseph Smith was allowed to dig them up, and then he translates this record. That's the story of the Book of Mormon in a nutshell. There's a lot more details you could give, but that's it in a nutshell, and just keep that in mind as we move forward, and it'll help explain some things later on down the road. All right, so Joseph Smith in 1827 gets the golden plates. Here's the interesting thing to me about this. We talked about previously, from 1820 to 1827, nobody heard anything about the first vision. In fact, it wasn't until many years after the church had been founded that even church members heard about the first vision. Nobody was talking about the first vision in 1820 in Palmyra, New York. Nobody was talking about the second vision and Moroni having appeared to Joseph Smith. Nobody ever had heard that story and wouldn't hear that story until way later. But what people were talking about in 1827 was Joseph Smith's found a golden book. And lots of people were hearing stories about a golden book long before they heard any other stories about how the church came to be. Lots of his neighbors and friends heard Joseph's got a golden book. So, some point in 1826 or 27, he begins telling them about this golden book that he had found by using his seer stone. And originally, there was no religious significance attached to this book at all. Parley Chase, one of his later neighbors, said that Smith told him the book was going to show him how to get money that was buried in the ground. And that makes sense with what we know of his mindset leading up to this time, right? He's been making his occupation trying to find money buried in the ground. One of his other neighbors, Abner Cole, made this statement that was printed in the newspaper in 1831, and it gives us some interesting details. He said that the elder Smith, this is Joe's dad, told him that his son Joe had seen the spirit, which he then described as a little old man with a long beard. Just tuck that away. And he was informed that he, Joseph, under certain circumstances, eventually would obtain great treasures. And we'll see that theme, that initially it wasn't a religious book, it was a book that was going to lead him to treasure. And that in due time, the Spirit would furnish Joseph with a book which would give an account of the ancient inhabitants of this country, where they had deposited their substance consisting of costly furniture and coins at the approach of the great deluge, and had been buried there ever since. And so it was going to show them where all of these treasures were hidden in the area. Joseph Caprone, another neighbor, made this statement. He said Joe Jr. pretended to find the plates. This scheme, he believed, would relieve the family from all pecuniary embarrassment. It's going to get them out of poverty. They were just broke as could be at this point. They were threatening to foreclose on his parents' farm, and they eventually did. They were just broke. And this book was going to get them out of the hole. It was going to finally get them out of debt. His father told that when the book was published, they would be enabled from the profits of the work to carry into successful operation of the money-digging business. It's going to get us out of debt, and it's finally going to set us up to get this money-digging business going. He gave me no intimation at that time that the book was to be of a religious character or that it had anything to do with revelation. He declared it to be a speculation, and he said, when it is completed, my family will be placed on a level above the generality of mankind. We're finally gonna, right? And, people are finally not going to be looking down on us because of our poverty anymore. We're finally going to get out of the hole, and we will finally be somebody with the profits that this book is going to make. And that was a common theme. We'll talk about this a whole lot more in a couple weeks, but in this translation process, not long after it was done, Joseph Smith sent Hiram Page and David Whitmer to Canada to try to sell the copyright to the Book of Mormon, the publishing rights to the book. And he said he had a revelation from God that somebody in Canada would buy the copyright for $8,000, which is, if I figured it right, according to the calculator I found online, $8,000 in 1828 money would be about $255,000 in our currency today. So that was a chunk of change. I wouldn't mind running into $250,000 myself tomorrow. I wouldn't turn it down. And so he tried to sell the rights in Canada. Again, we'll look at this in more detail, but they come back empty-handed, and that revelation didn't quite pan out the way Joseph had thought that it would. So all the early accounts say it wasn't a religious book, it was a book that was going to provide for them financially. Not only that, the earliest accounts we have differ a great deal on how the plates were found and how he got the book. You might remember the initial story is, the official story is, Moroni appeared to Joseph Smith in 1823 and told him about the record. He went and he found it, but Moroni said, "You can't take it with you now. Come back next year." And he came back the next year and the next year and the next year, and then finally in 1827 he was allowed to take the plates. Early accounts are a little bit different. And again, long before they heard about a church or any revelations and the fullness of the gospel and visions of God the Father and Jesus Christ, people heard about the gold book. And this is the story they heard. This is what Hyle Lewis said. This is Emma's cousin. And so he would have been around. They spent, the majority of that translation was done in Pennsylvania with Emma's family, so he would have been around to know. He said that Joseph said that by a dream he was informed that at such a place, in a certain hill, in an iron box, were some gold plates with curious engravings, which he must get and translate and write a book, that the plates were to be kept concealed from every human being for a certain time, some 2 or 3 years, that he went to the place and dug till he came to the stone that covered the box, when he was knocked down. That again he attempted to remove the stone and again was knocked down. This attempt was made the 3rd time, and the 3rd time he was knocked down. And then he exclaimed, "Why can't I get it?" Or words to that effect. And then he saw a man standing over the spot, which to him appeared like a Spaniard, having a long beard coming down over his breast to about here. And that the ghost's throat was cut from ear to ear, and the blood was streaming down. Now that sounds very familiar to me, doesn't it? Of a lot of accounts we were hearing in his previous money digging schemes. You might recall, right? There was story after story of we go to dig up the treasure and we'd get there and some spirit prevented us or some spirit was guarding it and we never could quite get to it. A lot of these early accounts are very similar. He goes to get the book and there's a spirit there guarding the book. He said that he would have to bring somebody else with him and then he could get it. Fayette Lapham made a similar statement, and he was a businessman in Palmyra who, by the time the publication came about, everybody in Palmyra had heard about the Book of Mormon being published and that it was coming. And so he went to talk to Smith Sr. One night, not long before the Book of Mormon came out. And this is the account Joseph Smith's dad gave him about how Joseph found the plates. So Joseph Smith Sr. said that about this time Joseph Jr. became concerned as to his future state of existence and was baptized, becoming a member of the Baptist Church, which you might remember, according to the first vision, God the Father said, "Don't do that." According to Joe's dad, he did do that. He joined the Baptist Church. Soon after joining the church, he had a singular dream, but he didn't tell his father of his dream until about a year afterwards. So he had a dream. A year later, he finally tells his dad, and this was the dream. He told his father in his dream, a very large and tall man appeared to him, dressed in an ancient suit of clothes, and the clothes were all bloody. Again, that's very similar to the account Heil Lewis gave, right? He doesn't specify that it's a Spaniard, but it's a man dressed in ancient clothes who's all bloody. And the man said to him that there was a valuable treasure buried many years since, not far from that place, and that the time had arrived for it to be brought to light for the benefit of the world at large. And if he would strictly follow his directions, he would direct him to the place where it was deposited in such a manner that he could obtain it. Later in the interview, he says, the Spirit said to him that when the treasure was deposited there, he was sworn to take charge of and protect the property until the time should arrive for it to be exhibited to the world of mankind. And in order to prevent his making an improper disclosure, to keep it from getting out at the wrong time, this spirit was murdered and slain on the spot. And his body was dumped there, and he'd been in charge of watching over this treasure ever since. And so those two accounts kind of run together. You could see how that would be one very similar story. In Joseph Smith Sr.'s account, Joe Jr. said the spirit was actually an ancient, probably Spaniard, who had been murdered and his body dumped there, and his spirit left to guard the treasure until Joe could come and get it. All right. This account is really interesting. Here's what Willard Chase said, another neighbor of the Smiths at the time. He said that in the month of June 1827, Joseph Smith Sr. related to me the following story, that some years ago a spirit had appeared to Joseph, his son, in a vision and informed him that in a certain place there was a record on plates of gold, and that he was the person that must obtain them, and he must do it in the following manner. On the 22nd of September, he must repair to the place where was deposited this manuscript dressed in black clothes and riding a black horse with a switched tail, and demand the book and a certain name, and after obtaining it, he must go directly away and neither lay it down nor look behind him. So they accordingly fitted out Joseph with a suit of black clothes and borrowed a black horse. He repaired to the place of deposit and demanded the book, which was in a stone box, unsealed, and so near the top of the ground that he could see one end of it. And raising it up, he took out the book of gold, but fearing someone might discover where he got it, he laid it down. And remember, he was just told, you're not supposed to lay it down. So he lays it down to place the stone back on top as he found it, and he turns around, and to his surprise, there's no book in sight. So he laid it down and went to put the stone back on top, and the book disappeared. But he again opened the box and saw the book, whoop, had gone right back to where it started. And so he took the book out again, or tried to take it out again, but he was hindered. And he saw in the box at that time something like a toad, which soon assumed the appearance of a man, and struck him on the side of the head. And not being discouraged at trifles, he again stooped down and strove to take the book, when the spirit struck him again and knocked him 3 or 4 rods and hurt him prodigiously. That's very similar to Heil Lewis's account, right? Where he said he got clobbered 4 times trying to get it. After recovering from his fright, he inquired why he could not obtain the plates, to which the spirit made reply, because you have not obeyed your orders. He then inquired when he could have them, and was answered thus, come 1 year from this day, and bring with you your oldest brother, and you shall have them. So, early accounts are kind of all over the place, but you see some similarities in these early stories that were circulating around about how he got the plates, but it's very different from what would become the official account of how he got the plates. A lot of early accounts also state that it wasn't Moroni that showed Smith the golden plates, that he used his seer stone to find the plates. This was a widely held belief by many early Mormons, that Joseph used his seer stone. As late as 1857, we have Mormon pioneer Hosea Stout recorded in his diary that Brigham Young had exhibited the seer stone by which the prophet Joseph Smith discovered the plates of the Book of Mormon. So as late as 1857, Brigham Young was apparently saying that Joseph Smith used these stones to discover the golden plates. Martin Harris certainly believed that that was how he found them. And again, we'll get to know Harris really, really well next week. But man, he was a believer. And he was a bit odd, but boy, he believed. And he went to his to his deathbed, believing in the Book of Mormon, even though he left the church after Joseph Smith died. He thought a lot of the leaders had apostatized, but he never stopped believing in the Book of Mormon. And he believed that Joseph Smith used his seer stone to found them. He found them by looking into the stone, and the family had likewise told me the same thing. And according to Harris's account, when he first heard about the golden plates, he went to all the family members first, and he interviewed them to get their story, and they all said that Joseph used the seer stone. And then he asked Joseph, and Joe Jr. agreed that yes, he had used the seer stone. And he never wavered from saying that was the story that he was told. So accounts are all over the place, really. When you boil it down, we might not ever know exactly how the story developed because there is such a wide, varying degree of stories that were circulating around. But what is clear, it seems to me, historically, is that people had heard about golden plates. And there was a lot of stories and a lot of rumors circulating about how Joseph had found those plates. But it does seem clear, too, that the story did develop over time to become something much different in the official version of the story much later. And it does seem to me pretty clear, historically speaking, that the religious aspects of the story didn't develop until much later. It appears from everything I can tell, and this makes total sense if you follow with the timeline we've looked at. Joseph Smith was a money digger. He went to Pennsylvania digging for gold, got arrested, got in trouble, had to leave town, takes his new bride, comes back to New York. This fits perfectly with what his mindset seems to have been at the time. And then he starts talking about his next adventure, which is there's golden plates buried, and I'm going to go get them, and it's going to make us all rich. And that follows along very well with everything that we know about him at the time. And it does seem clear it wasn't until later, and I think almost by accident, the religious aspects of the Book of Mormon developed far later. There's a lot of scholars that would agree with that. One scholar says the primitive designs of Mrs. Smith, her husband, Joe, and Cowdery was money-making. The idea of being the founders of a new sect was an afterthought in which they were aided by others. Emma's cousin, Hyle, agreed. And again, he was around during all of this time that it was being translated. He said, in all of this narrative, there was not one word about visions of God or of angels or heavenly revelations. All his information was by that dream and that bleeding ghost. The heavenly visions and messages of angels, etc., contained in Mormon books were afterthoughts, revised to order. Well, that was certainly the opinion of at least one person who was around when all of these things were taking place. I believe that's the case also, and hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that in the weeks ahead. Next week we will get into the nitty-gritty of where did this story come from? How on earth did he come up with the Book of Mormon? How did he translate these characters? Were there actually golden plates? What are Reformed Egyptian hieroglyphics? We're going to answer all of those questions and many, many more over the next couple weeks together. But thank you for being here today. If you have questions, I'll answer those in a minute. If you're watching online and you have questions, we'd love to sit down and talk to you further. But thank you for being here this morning. Let me pray for us, and we'll move on.